Important. The village of Greystone Hollow lay nestled in a fold of quiet countryside where time appeared to move with a certain deliberate restraint. The hedgerows were neatly kept, the cottages politely spaced, and the great house Greystone Manor stood at the edge of the village like an old memory that refused to fade. Its grey stone walls caught the afternoon light in such a way that it seemed both welcoming and watchful, as though it had seen too much to trust entirely in peace. On the afternoon of the annual Greystone Garden Gathering, the manor grounds were alive with gentle activity. Tables had been arranged across the lawn, dressed in linen and set with fine china that had not been used since the last summer fete. Roses climbed over trellises in soft abundance, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary village occasion, which is to say, it was anything but. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped parasol, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, her eyes moving with quiet interest from one guest to another. She had arrived at the invitation of Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, the current mistress of Greystone Manor, whose reputation for hospitality was exceeded only by her talent for knowing precisely who should and should not be invited to any given event. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Whitcomb had said earlier, in her smooth and practiced tone, "one must keep these gatherings balanced. Too much familiarity breeds dullness, and too many strangers invite speculation." Miss Marple had smiled politely at that. In her experience, speculation required very little encouragement. The guests moved in small, shifting groups across the lawn. Important. Colonel Ashford, recently retired and still inclined to speak as though issuing commands, stood near the rosebeds recounting a story that no one had yet managed to interrupt. Miss Penelope Graves, who managed the village library with a severity that discouraged both conversation and overdue books, hovered near the tea-table, observing everything with a gaze that missed little and approved less. Dr. Simon Hargreaves, tall and thoughtful, spoke quietly with a younger man, Mr. Oliver Trent, whose easy charm and carefully careless manner suggested someone accustomed to being liked. Not far from them stood Lydia Trent, his wife, her composure perfect, her smile measured. And then there was Mr. Arthur Blackwood. He had arrived later than the others, which in itself was unusual enough to be remarked upon. Greystone Manor had once belonged to his family, though circumstances never discussed openly had led to its passing into Mrs. Whitcomb's possession some years before. His presence, therefore, carried a certain tension like a note slightly out of tune. Miss Marple watched him with interest. He was a man in his early 50s, with a face that had once been handsome but now bore the faint marks of strain. His clothes were well chosen, though not quite new, and he carried himself with the air of someone who had returned not entirely by choice. Mrs. Whitcomb greeted him with impeccable grace. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. "How very good of you to come." "My dear Mrs. Whitcomb," he replied with a slight bow. It seemed appropriate. There was something in the pause before that last word that did not go unnoticed. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him a moment longer. Appropriate, she thought, was often a word used when one meant inevitable, important. The afternoon unfolded pleasantly enough. Tea was poured, compliments exchanged, and the small rituals of village society observed with their usual care. Yet beneath it all ran a subtle current barely perceptible, but present. Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Blackwood avoided standing too near the house, how Mrs. Whitcomb's smile tightened just slightly when he spoke, how Dr. Hargreaves watched both of them with a thoughtful frown, and how Lydia Trent, though she spoke lightly, kept her attention fixed on matters that did not concern her. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like watching a drawing-room play in which all the actors knew their lines but none trusted the ending. At 4:30, as the sunlight softened and the shadows lengthened across the lawn, Mrs. Whitcomb rose. "My dear friends," she said, "before we disperse, I thought it might be pleasant to take a brief turn through the west garden. The roses are at their best just now." There was general agreement, and the guests began to gather. Mr. Blackwood hesitated. "I think," he said, "I should prefer to remain here for a moment." Mrs. Whitcomb's gaze rested on him. "As you wish," she said. The others moved away, their voices drifting lightly as they followed the gravel path toward the far end of the grounds. Miss Marple rose with them, though not before casting one last glance over her shoulder. Mr. Blackwood had taken a seat near the stone balustrade. He appeared, for the first time that afternoon, entirely alone, and not at ease. Miss Marple did not hurry. She allowed herself to fall slightly behind the others, her steps unhurried, her expression mild. From this position she could still see the lawn, still observing without being observed. It was then that she noticed something. Mr. Important. Blackwood reached into his coat pocket. He drew out a small object, something metallic, perhaps catching the last of the light. He looked at it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, quite suddenly, he closed his hand around it. From the direction of the house, a door opened. Someone stepped out onto the terrace. Miss Marple could not yet see who it was, but Mr. Blackwood had. He rose at once, and in that moment brief, almost imperceptible, his composure broke. It was not fear, exactly, but it was very close. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly, because in her experience such moments rarely passed without consequence. And indeed, within minutes, they did not. A scream rang out across the gardens, clear, sharp, and unmistakably real. The gathering dissolved at once into confusion. Voices rose. Footsteps hurried. And Miss Marple, turning calmly back toward the manor lawn, knew with quiet certainty that something had ended, and something else far more troubling had just begun. Important. The scream had come from the terrace, and by the time the others reached it, the stillness that followed was in some ways more alarming than the sound itself. It seemed to settle over Greystone Manor like a weight, pressing upon the guests and robbing them, for a moment, of ordinary speech. Mrs. Whitcomb was the first to arrive, her skirts gathered in one hand, her face drained of all its practiced poise. Colonel Ashford came behind her, moving with surprising speed for a man who complained so often of his knee. Dr. Hargreaves pushed past them both with professional purpose. Lydia Trent stopped short at the edge of the lawn, one gloved hand rising to her mouth. Oliver Trent, who had been speaking lightly only moments before, now looked blank with shock. Mr. Arthur Blackwood lay at the foot of the terrace steps. He was not sprawled untidily, as one might expect after a fall, but twisted in a manner that seemed unnatural, one arm bent beneath him, the other outstretched as though he had reached for something in his final instant and failed to grasp it. His face was turned partly toward the house, and even from a short distance there was something in its set that suggested not merely pain but astonishment. Dr. Hargreaves knelt beside him without speaking. His fingers went first to the wrist, then to the throat. He remained in that position a moment longer than was necessary, as if reluctant to rise and give shape to what everyone already feared. At last he stood. "He is dead," he said quietly. No one answered at once. The words seemed to move through the gathering in stages. Mrs. Whitcomb made a small, involuntary sound and put a hand against the stone balustrade beside her. Important. Colonel Ashford drew himself up stiffly, his expression hardening into something stern and military, as though discipline might be imposed on death itself. Miss Graves, arriving somewhat breathlessly behind the others, stopped dead and stared with keen, almost offended intensity. Lydia Trent spoke first. "But how?" she said. "He was sitting here only a moment ago." "Yes," said Dr. Hargreaves, "so he was." His tone was thoughtful rather than emotional, and Miss Marple noticed at once that this did not come from indifference. It came from concentration. She had reached the edge of the terrace now and stood slightly apart from the others, her eyes moving quietly over the scene. The body, the steps, the terrace doors, the patch of lawn where a teacup, dropped in haste, lay on its side with its contents soaking into the grass. It was always surprising how many small things remained visible after a calamity, as though the world declined to tidy itself in deference to human distress. There was no obvious sign of violence, no blood, no broken stone, no sign that Blackwood had fallen from a great height, and yet there he was, dead at the foot of 3 shallow steps that could scarcely have killed a healthy man. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the terrace. One of the French doors stood open. Beyond it lay the morning room, dim after the brightness outside. A chair near the doorway had been moved slightly askew, and a small side table beside it bore a decanter, 2 glasses, and a silver cigarette box. One of the glasses was empty. The other still held a little amber liquid catching the light. Mrs. Whitcomb followed Dr. Hargreaves' gaze. "He came in briefly," she said, and her voice sounded strange, as though it belonged to someone else. "Only for a moment. Important. He said he wanted a word with me later. Then I joined the others in the West Garden." "A word about what?" asked Colonel Ashford. She looked at him sharply, as if resentful of the question simply because it had been spoken aloud. "I do not know." Miss Marple thought that answer may well have been true, but not entirely complete. Oliver Trent had moved closer now, though with visible reluctance. He stared down at the dead man, his handsome face unsettled. "I saw someone come out of the house," he said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. "Been?" asked the doctor. "Just before the scream, or perhaps a few seconds before. I am not certain." He swallowed. "I was at the rear of the group. I looked back and thought I saw a figure on the terrace." "Who?" said Colonel Ashford sharply. Oliver shook his head. "I couldn't tell." Miss Graves gave a thin little sniff. "That is either very unfortunate or very convenient." "Penelope," said Mrs. Whitcomb coldly. But Miss Marple had not missed the flicker that crossed Lydia Trent's face at her husband's words. It was not a surprise. It was apprehension, and that, she thought, was interesting. Dr. Hargreaves knelt once more, this time examining the dead man's coat and hands with greater care. "He was holding something," Miss Marple said softly. The doctor looked up. "What makes you say that?" She pointed with one gloved finger. The right hand, though empty now, was curled in a peculiar half-grip, as though reluctant to release what had once been there. Dr. Hargreaves' expression altered. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I believe you may be right." Miss Marple said nothing more, but in her mind a small, definite thought had already begun to form. Mr. Arthur Blackwood had expected something on that terrace. Important. He had seen someone emerge from the house, and whatever he had taken from his pocket only moments earlier was now gone. Important. The immediate confusion settled into something more contained as practicalities asserted themselves. Colonel Ashford, finding purpose at last, declared that no one was to leave the grounds. Mrs. Whitcomb, pale but controlled, sent a servant to telephone the police. Dr. Hargreaves remained by the body, his manner now wholly professional, though Miss Marple noticed that he was slower in his movements than before, as though something about the scene required more thought than he was prepared to admit. The others drifted into small groups, speaking in low tones. Shock had not diminished curiosity, it had only sharpened it. Miss Marple remained near the terrace, her attention divided between the body and the open French door. She had learned that it was often useful to consider not only what had happened, but what ought to have happened and did not. If Mr. Blackwood had come to meet someone, then that meeting had been brief, too brief perhaps for ordinary conversation, and yet long enough for something to be exchanged. Her eyes moved once more to his hand. Yes, something had been taken. Colonel Ashford approached her. "A most unpleasant business," he said, "but we must be practical. The man must have slipped, taken ill, something of that sort." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "Do you think so?" He frowned slightly. "There is no sign of violence, and one cannot go about assuming murder at every unfortunate occurrence." "No," she agreed. "That would be quite exhausting." He seemed reassured by her tone, though she had not, in fact, agreed with him at all. Behind them, Miss Graves had begun speaking in her thin, precise voice. "It is very odd," she was saying, "that Mr. Blackwood should return here after so many years. Very odd indeed. Important. And on the very day of a public gathering." Mrs. Whitcomb turned toward her. "I invited him," she said. There was a faint pause. "Then that," said Miss Graves, "is still odder." The remark hung in the air, faintly impertinent, faintly justified. Mrs. Whitcomb's composure did not break, but it tightened. "There is nothing odd in extending hospitality," she said. "No," Miss Marple murmured softly. "But there is sometimes something very interesting in accepting it." No one appeared to hear her. Oliver Trent had moved closer to Lydia now, speaking to her in low tones. She listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed not on him but on the terrace door. When he finished, she gave a small shake of her head. Miss Marple noticed. Dr. Hargreaves rose again and turned to the group. "There is no obvious injury," he said. "No sign of a fall sufficient to cause death. I should prefer not to speculate further until a proper examination has been made." Colonel Ashford nodded approvingly. "Quite right. No use jumping to conclusions." Miss Marple thought that conclusions, like certain plants, had a habit of growing whether one encouraged them or not. The sound of a motor car approached from the lane. It slowed, then stopped. "Ah," said Colonel Ashford. "That will be the police." There was a subtle shift among the guests. Positions were adjusted, expressions composed. Each person, consciously or not, prepared to be observed. Miss Marple remained where she was. The inspector who entered was a man of middle height with a calm, deliberate manner. He took in the scene at Onseth Body, the arrangement of the group, the open door, and Miss Marple saw at once that he was not a man easily misled by appearances. Inspector Hale. He spoke first to Mrs. Whitcomb, then to Dr. Important. Hargreaves, his questions quiet but precise. He did not hurry, nor did he allow himself to be hurried. Miss Marple approved. After a few moments he turned his attention to the terrace. "You say he was sitting here?" he asked. "Yes," said Mrs. Whitcomb. "And he entered the house briefly?" "Yes." Inspector Hale stepped toward the open door and looked inside. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He noticed the glasses, the chair, the position of the table, and then, quite suddenly, his gaze dropped to the floor just inside the doorway. He did not speak, but something in his expression altered. Miss Marple followed his line of sight. There was nothing obvious there, nothing at all, and yet she felt that same quiet certainty again. Something was missing. Inspector Hale straightened. "Before we proceed further," he said, turning back to the group, "I should like to know, did anyone see Mr. Blackwood with anything in his hands before he came to this terrace?" There was a pause. Miss Marple folded her hands, because she was quite certain of one thing. Whatever Mr. Blackwood had taken from his pocket only moments before his death, someone here had already seen it, and chosen not to say. Important. Inspector Hale did not press his question immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, watching as each person, in turn, considered their answerer, their decision not to give one. It was a small test, Miss Marple thought, but a revealing one. Mrs. Whitcomb spoke first. "I noticed nothing," she said, her voice steady. "He had been seated when I last saw him. His hands were empty." Colonel Ashford gave a brisk nod. "Same for me. No object of any kind. If there had been, I should have observed it." Miss Graves lifted her chin slightly. "I was not watching his hands," she said. "One cannot be expected to attend to such details at a social gathering." Mr. Oliver Trent hesitated. "I thought," he began, then stopped. Inspector Hale's attention settled on him at once. "Yes," Oliver shifted his weight. "I may be mistaken. It was only a glance. But I had the impression that he was holding something small, metal perhaps. It caught the light. There was a faint stir." "What sort of thing?" asked the inspector. "I couldn't say," Oliver replied. "Something no larger than a cigarette case, or a lighter. It was gone almost at onset. Put it back in his pocket, I think." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she thought. That agreed very well with what she had seen. Inspector Hale made a note. "And you, Mrs. Trent," he said. Lydia looked up, her expression composed. "I saw nothing," she said. It was said clearly, without hesitation. Too clearly, Miss Marple thought. Dr. Hargreaves spoke next. "I cannot assist you there," he said. "My attention was elsewhere." "Of course," said the inspector. His gaze moved on, settling briefly on Miss Marple. "And you, Miss Marple," she said gently. "I did not see it clearly, but I had the same impression as Mr. Trent. That Mr. Important Blackwood carried something he considered important." Inspector Hale nodded. "Then we may take that as established." He turned slightly, his eyes moving again toward the open French door. "If that object is no longer present," he said, We must ask ourselves where it has gone. Colonel Ashford gave a short, impatient sound. It may have fallen, he said. Slipped from his hand when he collapsed. A possibility, said the inspector. He stepped down from the terrace and examined the ground carefully, his movements slow and methodical. The grass was short, the earth firm. There was nothing to suggest that any small object had been dropped or concealed there. After a moment he straightened. I do not think it is here. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. No, she murmured. I do not think it is. Inspector Hale glanced at her. Then where, Miss Marple? She smiled faintly. Somewhere it was taken, she said. There was a brief silence. Inspector Hale's expression did not change, but something in his manner sharpened. Then we must consider who had the opportunity to take it, he said. His gaze moved across the group. Mr. Blackwood was alone on this terrace for a short time. Then someone emerged from the house. Mr. Trent believes he saw a figure. Oliver nodded. Yes, I could not identify who. Inspector Hale turned toward the house. Who was inside at that moment? There was a pause. Mrs. Whitcomb spoke. I had left the morning room shortly before joining the others in the west garden. And after that? I cannot say. Miss Graves spoke, her voice precise. I remained outside. I did not enter the house. Colonel Ashford shook his head. Nor did I. All eyes turned, almost involuntarily, toward Dr. Hargreaves. He met the inspector's gaze. Important. I was with the others, he said. I did not return to the house until after the scream. And you, Mrs. Trent? Lydia's expression did not alter. I was in the garden, she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. For the briefest moment something flickered there, not uncertainty, not quite but awareness. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. Very well, he said, but Miss Marple thought that he was not convinced. Nor, indeed, was she, because there was something else. Something small, easily overlooked. She glanced once more toward the terrace door. At the table inside, 2 glasses, one empty, one not. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. Yes, that, she thought, was not quite right at all, and someone in this house knew exactly why. Important. The inspector's attention, having lingered briefly on the terrace, shifted once more toward the open French doors. Without announcing his intention, he stepped inside the morning room, and the others followed more cautiously, as though crossing that threshold required a subtle adjustment of expectation. Miss Marple entered last. The room bore the unmistakable signs of recent use, yet nothing in it appeared disturbed. The chair near the door had been moved slightly, not overturned, merely displaced as though someone had risen quickly. The small table beside it held the decanter and the 2 glasses Miss Marple had already observed. The air carried a faint trace of spirits, sharp and clean. Inspector Hale paused beside the table. You said Mr. Blackwood came in here briefly, he said, addressing Mrs. Whitcomb. Yes, she replied. Only for a moment. I was not with him. I had already gone outside. And no one else entered. Not to my knowledge. Inspector Hale looked at the glasses. One has been used, he said. The other has not. Dr. Hargreaves stepped forward. It is possible he poured himself a drink, he said. A man might do so even in a short interval. Yes, said the inspector. He might. Miss Marple moved a little closer, her gaze resting on the table with mild interest. It is curious, she said softly, how often people pour 2 glasses when they expect company. There was a slight pause. Inspector Hale turned his head. You think he was expecting someone in this room? It would seem so, she replied. Otherwise, why the 2nd glass? Dr. Hargreaves frowned slightly. It may have been poured earlier. Yes, said Miss Marple, that is possible. But her tone suggested that she did not think so. Important. Inspector Hale bent slightly, examining the contents of the remaining glass without touching it. Still nearly full, he observed, and no sign of dilution. It has not stood long. He straightened, which suggests that someone was expecting and did not drink. Miss Marple inclined her head. Or choose not to. The inspector's gaze moved around the room, then down to the carpet near the doorway. Again that small, intent pause. Miss Marple followed his glance. Nothing, and yet once more the impression remained. Something absent. Something that should have been there. Behind them, Lydia Trent spoke. "This is all very speculative," she said. "A glass of wine proves nothing." Her voice was controlled, but there was a faint edge beneath it. Inspector Hale turned toward her. "No," he said, "not by itself." Miss Marple looked at Lydia thoughtfully. "But combined with other small things," she murmured, "it can become quite suggestive." Lydia met her gaze briefly, then looked away. Oliver shifted beside her. "You are not suggesting," he said, "that someone came in here, met Blackwood, and then what? Followed him outside?" "It is a possibility," said the inspector. Dr. Hargreaves spoke again. "If that were the case, we must consider whether the meeting itself had any bearing on his death." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "I think it did." There was a pause. Inspector Hale turned to her. "In what way?" Miss Marple clasped her hands lightly. "Mr. Blackwood came here with something on his mind," she said. "We know that. He also had something in his possession, something he examined just before rising to meet whoever approached him." She glanced toward the terrace. "That object is now missing." Inspector Hale nodded. "And you believe it was taken here?" "Important." "No," she said gently. "I believe it was seen here." The distinction hung in the air. Dr. Hargreaves frowned. "I do not follow." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "If someone met him in this room, they would have seen what he carried. They would have understood its importance. And when he went outside he was alone, again that knowledge would not have left them." Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. "You are suggesting that the object was taken after he left this room?" "Yes," she said. "And by someone who had just seen it?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." There was a brief silence. Inspector Hale turned slowly back toward the terrace door. "Then we must consider," he said, "who that person might have been." Miss Marple did not answer. Her gaze had moved once more to the table, to the untouched glass, to the faint mark on its rim barely visible in the light. She smiled very slightly. Because now, she thought, something else had become clear. Whoever had met Mr. Blackwood in this room had stood very close to him, and had left something behind. Even if they believed they had not. Important. Inspector Hale did not at once pursue Miss Marple's last remark. Instead, he remained where he was, his attention fixed upon the glass with a quiet intensity. Then, without touching it, he turned slightly toward Dr. Hargreaves. "I should like this examination," he said, carefully. Dr. Hargreaves inclined his head. "Of course." Miss Marple watched the exchange with interest. It was always reassuring when practical men were willing to follow a line of thought, even when it appeared to lead into very small details. The inspector stepped back from the table. "For the moment," he said, "we will assume that Mr. Blackwood met someone in this room shortly before his death. That person did not drink, or drank very little. They then allowed him to go out onto the terrace where, within minutes, he collapsed." Colonel Ashford frowned. "That seems an unnecessarily complicated way of putting it. If there was foul play, why not act here? Why allow him to leave the room at all?" Inspector Hale did not answer immediately. Miss Marple spoke instead. "Because," she said gently, "something was not yet decided." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" asked Lydia Trent. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I mean that when people meet to discuss something important, they do not always begin with violence. They begin with words, and sometimes those words lead to a decision on that might not have been intended at the start." Dr. Hargreaves nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that would explain the short interval. A conversation, perhaps an argument, then a separation." And then Miss Marple added softly, "An opportunity." Inspector Hale glanced at her. "You believe the decision was made after they left this room?" "I do," she said. The inspector considered this, then nodded once. "Important. Then we must look again at who was near the terrace at that moment." His gaze moved across the group. "Mr. Trent, you said you saw someone emerge from the house."
Yay.
"This room, I believe so. And you could not identify them?" "No." Inspector Hale turned to Lydia. "And you, Mrs. Trent, you were in the garden?" "Yes." Her answer came at once. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. "It is curious," she said mildly, "how often we remember where we were standing but not what we were doing." Lydia's expression tightened. "I was walking with the others." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Of course." Inspector Hale did not intervene, but he was watching closely now. Miss Graves spoke suddenly. "I noticed something," she said. "It may be of no importance, but just before we heard the scream, I thought I saw Mrs. Trent turn back toward the house." All eyes turned at once. Lydia did not move. "I did no such thing," she said. Miss Graves lifted her chin. "I may be mistaken, but I have a very good memory for movement." Oliver Trent stepped forward. "This is absurd," he said. "Lydia was with me." Miss Marple looked at him. "For the entire time?" she asked gently. He hesitated. "Not every second." The silence that followed was brief but telling. Inspector Hale spoke. "Mrs. Trent, did you return to the house at any point?" "No." "Did you enter this room?" "No." Miss Marple said nothing, but she watched Lydia very closely. There was something there, no something beneath the composure. Not fear exactly. Not yet, but tension. Inspector Hale turned slightly. "Dr. Hargreaves, you said the death was sudden." "Yes." "Could it have been caused by something taken, something ingested shortly before he left this room?" There was a pause. "Important." "It is possible," the doctor said, "though I would not wish to state it definitively without examination." Miss Marple inclined her head. "But if it was so," she said softly, "then the important moment would not be on the terrace at all." Inspector Hale looked at her. No, she said. "It would be here." She glanced once more at the glass. "And whatever passed between them in this room, whether words or something else, would have mattered very much indeed." Inspector Hale followed her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think it would." Miss Marple folded her hands again. Because now, she thought, the pattern was becoming clearer. The meeting, the missing object, the untouched glass, and the person who had something to gain from all three. Yes. It would not be long now. Important. The tension within the morning room did not dissipate, it deepened. What had begun as uncertainty was now settling into direction, and with direction came discomfort. People shifted their positions, not to move away, but as though attempting to stand differently within the same space. Inspector Hale remained near the table, his attention divided between the glass and the group. He had said very little since Miss Marple's last observation, but his silence had become more deliberate. Miss Marple, for her part, allowed the moment to breathe. It was never wise to force conclusions too quickly. Human nature, she had often found, had a way of completing its own patterns when given just enough space. Lydia Trent broke first. "This is becoming rather absurd," she said. "We are discussing possibilities without evidence. A man has deed perhaps of natural causes, and we are inventing elaborate scenarios to explain it." Her voice was controlled, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, a faint impatience that had not been present before. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear," she said, "it is not the scenarios that are elaborate, only the circumstances." Inspector Hale turned slightly. "You do not believe this was a natural death," he said. Miss Marple considered. "I believe," she said, "that Mr. Blackwood was already under strain. That is often enough to cause a collapse. But I do not think it explains everything." "What does it fail to explain?" he asked. She gestured lightly toward the table. "The second glass," she said. "And the fact that it was not used." Dr. Hargreaves frowned. "You think that is significant?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Because when two people meet, and only one drinks, it suggests that one is at ease and the other is not." "Important." Inspector Hale nodded slightly. "And which was which?" Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly to Lydia. "I think," she said, "that Mr. Blackwood expected the meeting. He prepared for it. He poured the drink. But the other person, whoever it was, did not remain long enough to accept it." There was a pause. "Why not?" "Why not?" asked Oliver. "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "they had already seen what they needed to see." The silence deepened. Inspector Hale spoke. "The object." "Yes." He looked at Lydia again. "And you deny entering this room?" "I do." Miss Marple did not contradict her. Instead, she said, "It is curious how people often remember the larger movements of a day, but not the smaller ones. A step taken alone, a moment's hesitation, a return for something forgotten." Lydia's expression tightened. "I have nothing to add." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No," she said. "Not yet." Miss Graves spoke again, her voice thin but insistent. "I am quite certain I saw someone turn back, not for long but distinctly. And it was not Mr. Trent." Oliver flushed. "This is ridiculous, is it?" said Miss Marple softly. He stopped. Inspector Hale's gaze moved between them. "Mr. Trent, when you say you saw someone emerge from the house, what precisely did you see?" Oliver hesitated. "A figure," he said, "at the door, just for a moment. Could it have been your wife?" There was a pause. I suppose it could have been," he said reluctantly. Lydia turned to him sharply. "You said you did not see who it was." "I didn't," he replied. "Not clearly." Miss Marple watched them both. Relationships, she thought, were often most revealing under strain. Dr. Hargreaves spoke again. "If we are to pursue this line of thought, we must consider timing. The meeting in this room, important. The movement to the terrace. The collapse. There is very little interval between them." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very little." Inspector Hale nodded, which suggests that whatever occurred here had an immediate effect. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Or that it set something in motion." There was a pause. Inspector Hale looked at her. "You are drawing a distinction." "Yes," she said. "A small one but an important one." He waited. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more to the glass. "It is not always what is taken that matters," she said quietly. "Sometimes it is what is left behind." No one spoke. The words seemed to settle slowly, their meaning not yet fully clear. But Miss Marple felt it, very distinctly. The final piece. It was there. Not hidden, not lost, simply overlooked. And when it was seen properly, everything else would follow. Important. Inspector Hale did not immediately respond to Miss Marple's last remark, but there was a perceptible shift in his attention. He turned once more to the table, studying the arrangement with renewed care, as though the meaning of it had altered in some subtle but decisive way. "What is left behind?" he repeated. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Dr. Hargreaves moved closer, his professional curiosity now fully engaged. "You are suggesting that something in this room, something we have already seen, has been overlooked?" "I think so," said Miss Marple gently. "Not overlooked entirely, perhaps, but not understood." Inspector Hale stepped nearer to the table again. "The glass," he said. "Yes." He bent slightly, examining it more closely. "You mentioned earlier that it appeared unused," he said. "And yet," he stopped. Miss Marple waited. "And yet there is a mark," he said slowly. "Faint but present." Dr. Hargreaves leaned in. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Under him." Inspector Hale straightened. "Then someone did drink," he said, "or began to," Miss Marple replied. There was a pause. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened, and then stopped. "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly across the room. "When people are interrupted," she said, "they often leave things unfinished." Lydia Trent spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "This proves nothing. Someone may have taken a sip and set it down. That is hardly remarkable." "No," said Miss Marple. "Not remarkable, but perhaps revealing." Inspector Hale turned to Lydia. "Would you care to explain why?" She met his gaze steadily. "No." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is quite understandable," she said. "Explanations are often difficult until one knows exactly what is being explained." There was silence. "Important." Inspector Hale spoke again. "If someone drank from that glass, even briefly, then we may assume they were present here with Mr. Blackwood. That narrows our possibilities." He looked around the room. "Who among you would have accepted a drink, even momentarily?" No one answered. Miss Marple said softly, "Someone who felt at ease wished to appear so." Inspector Hale nodded. "And someone who was close enough to him to do so without hesitation." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Her gaze moved once more to Lydia, then to Oliver. then briefly to Mrs. Whitcomb. Each face, she thought, held something different, but only one held what she was looking for. Dr. Hargreaves spoke again. If the glass was used, even slightly, then it may tell us something more. If there was anything in the drink he did not finish. Inspector Hale's expression altered. "You are suggesting I am suggesting nothing definite," the doctor said quickly. "Only if the death was sudden, and if something was taken shortly before, then we must consider every possibility." Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "every possibility." Inspector Hale turned again to the table. "And the missing object," he said. "We return to that." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. If it was seen here, if it was recognized, then it may have been taken after he left the room. Or just before," she said. There was a pause. Inspector Hale looked at her. "You think the decision was made here?" "I think," she said gently, "that the opportunity was created here." The distinction lingered. Inspector Hale considered it. "And the act itself?" Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the terrace. "Came later," she said. There was silence. The pattern, though not yet spoken aloud, had begun to take shape in the room. Important. Each piece now seemed to connect to the next with quiet inevitability. Inspector Hale turned back to the group. "I believe," he said, "that we are very close to understanding what happened here." No one spoke. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. Yes, she thought, very close indeed, because now it was no longer a question of what had happened, only of who had chosen to do it. Important. Inspector Hale allowed the silence to settle once more, but this time it carried a different quality. It was no longer uncertain. It was expectant. Each person in the room seemed aware, whether consciously or not, that the matter had reached a point beyond which it could not remain unresolved. "I think," he said at last, "we must consider the sequence very carefully." He began to pace slowly, not restlessly, but with measured intention. "Mr. Blackwood enters this room. He expects to meet someone. He pours a drink possibly too. He is in possession of an object of some importance. That object is seen by the person he meets here." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," Inspector Hale continued. "They speak. Something passes between them, words, perhaps more. The second person takes at least a sip from the glass. Then, for some reason, the meeting ends abruptly. Mr. Blackwood leaves the room and goes onto the terrace. And he is still in possession of the object at that point," Miss Marple added softly. "Precisely," said the inspector, "because it is not found here." He stopped, turning to face them. Moments later he collapses. The object is gone. Colonel Ashford frowned. "Then the simplest explanation is that whoever met him here followed him outside, took the object, and what? Caused his death?" Dr. Hargreaves spoke carefully. "If the death was not natural, it must have been induced. But there is no sign of force." "No," said Miss Marple. "No force." Inspector Hale looked at her. "Then how?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her gaze moved slowly across the room, resting briefly on each face. It was not a searching look, but a confirming one. "Important. At last," she said, "people sometimes carry with them what is needed to harm another, not in their hands, but in their knowledge." There was a pause. Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. "You believe the cause was not physical in the ordinary sense." "I believe," she said, "that Mr. Blackwood was already under considerable strain. We have all observed that. When such a person is confronted with something sudden, something unexpected, can have a very immediate effect." "Shock," said Dr. Hargreaves. "Yes." Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "Then the meeting here, whatever was said, set that in motion." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes. And the final moment and the terrace completed it." There was silence. Miss Marple's eyes moved to Lydia Trent. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think so." Lydia did not move. Inspector Hale followed Miss Marple's gaze. "Mrs. Trent," he said, "I must ask you again, did you return to the house before the scream?" Lydia's voice was steady. "No." Miss Marple spoke gently. "It is a very natural thing," she said, "to return for something one has forgotten. A glove, perhaps, or a word left unsaid." Lydia's eyes flickered. "I did not forget anything." "No," said Miss Marple, But you may have remembered something. There was a pause. Oliver looked at his wife. Lydia, she did not look at him. Inspector Hale's voice was calm. If you entered this room even briefly, it would be better to say so now. Lydia's composure held. I did not. Miss Marple watched her quietly. Then she said, You did not stay long. The words fell softly, but they struck. Lydia turned to her. I have already said yes, said Miss Marple. But you did not deny being here just now. You denied remaining. There was silence. Inspector Hale did not interrupt. Important, Miss Marple continued, her tone unchanged. You came in. You saw him. You saw what he held. You understood it at once. And you knew what it meant. Lydia's hand tightened at her side. You are mistaken. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said, because when Mr. Trent spoke of seeing someone at the door, you did not ask who. You did not show surprise. You showed concern. Oliver stared at her. That isn't true. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. My dear, you were not looking at the right moment. Inspector Hale stepped forward. Mrs. Trent, he said, I think you should answer Miss Marple. There was a long pause. Then Lydia spoke. I went in, she said. The words were quiet, but only for a moment. No one spoke. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. Only for a moment. Important. The admission did not come with drama, but its effect was immediate. The room seemed to contract around Lydia Trent, as though her quiet words had drawn every eye and fixed it upon her. Inspector Hale did not raise his voice. Tell us what happened, he said. Lydia stood very still for a moment, as if considering not what to say, but how much. I went into the room, she said at last. I had left my gloves there earlier. I saw Mr. Blackwood. He was by the table. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. And he showed you what he had, she said. Lydia's gaze flickered. No, she said. He did not show me. But I saw it. Inspector Hale spoke. What was it? There was a pause. A letter, Lydia said. Folded. Old, perhaps, but I recognized the writing. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, she said. I thought you might. Oliver looked at her sharply. Lydia had letter? She did not look at him. It was not meant for you, she said. Inspector Hale's tone remained calm. And what did it contain? Lydia hesitated. Something that should not have come to light, she said. Something from the past. Miss Marple spoke gently. Something that connected you to Greystone Manor before your marriage. There was silence. Lydia's composure faltered just slightly. Yes, she said. Oliver took a step back. You never told me no, she said. Because it was over. It was finished. Miss Marple watched her kindly. But not forgotten, she said. Lydia closed her eyes briefly. No, she said. Inspector Hale spoke. And Mr. Blackwood knew this? Important. Yes. And he brought the letter here. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. He came to confront you, she said softly. Or perhaps to bargain. Lydia's voice tightened. He had no right. No, said Miss Marple. Important, but people rarely consider rights when they have something to gain. Inspector Hale stepped closer. What happened in the room? Lydia opened her eyes. He spoke to me, she said. He said I should be careful, that the past has a way of returning. I told him it was finished, that it meant nothing now. And 10, asked the inspector. He turned away, she said, as if the matter were settled. But I knew it was not. Miss Marple inclined her head. Because he still had the letter, yes. And you followed him outside. Lydia did not deny it. Yes, she said. There was a pause. Inspector Hale's voice was steady. What happened on the terrace? Lydia's hands tightened slightly. I spoke to him again, she said. I asked him to give it to me. He refused. He said it might be useful. Oliver made a sharp sound. Useful? Miss Marple said quietly. For influence, perhaps. Or advantage. Lydia nodded faintly. Yes. Inspector Hale waited. And 10. I told him, she said, that if he exposed it, it would destroy everything. Not just for me, for others as well. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly toward Mrs. Whitcomb. Yes, she murmured. I think so, Lydia continued. He laughed, she said. not cruelly, but as though it did not matter, as though nothing mattered. Her voice faltered, then steadied, and then he changed. His face, it was as though something had struck him. He swayed just for a moment and then he fell. There was silence. Inspector Hale spoke. "You did not touch him." "No." "And the letter?" Lydia's voice was very quiet. "I took it." Oliver stared at her. I had to," she said. "You don't understand," Miss Marple said gently. "My dear, one always understands more than one wishes to." Important. Inspector Hale's expression was grave. "You removed evidence from a scene of sudden death." "Yes." "And concealed it." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "And Mr. Blackwood's death, I did not kill him," she said. Miss Marple spoke softly. "No," she said. "You did not." The room seemed to exhale. Inspector Hale looked at her. "You are certain?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, "because the cause was already there, in him. The fear, the strain, the moment of shock. What Mrs. Trent did was not the causer but the consequence." There was a long pause. Inspector Hale closed his notebook. "Even so," he said, "the matter of the letter must be addressed." Lydia bowed her head slightly. "I understand." Miss Marple folded her hands once more. "The past," she said gently, "has a curious way of insisting upon itself, but it is rarely as powerful as we imagine until we allow it to be." Outside, the evening had settled fully over Greystone Manor. The gardens, so lively only hours before, were now quiet, their order restored. Yet something remained, a faint unease, a reminder that beneath even the most peaceful surfaces, human lives carried shadows of their own making. And Miss Marple, serene as ever, reflected that it was not the crime itself that lingered longest, but the choices that led to it.